at one level, I had a very traditional Delhi middle class upbringing,
Mhm.
and ended up going to IIT Delhi and then MBA from FMS, and then the normal route to ICICI.
Right.
But when we were growing up, my parents had a fairly different perspective. So I remember from a very early age, it was drilled into us how ridiculously, insanely lucky we were in the context of India and in a broader historical context. And I remember my parents telling us that with this sort of fortune comes a responsibility.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Aspire and Acquire podcast. I'm your host, Sandeep Suri. Join me for listening to some incredible stories about some of the best professionals from very diverse fields like combat flying, robotic surgery, dancing, tea farming, journalism, deep sea diving, and so on. These accomplished professionals are not just outstanding in their jobs, but also have unique stories to share with us. We have tried to make the show truly global by having these guests from different parts of the world. In today's interconnected world, understanding the intricacies of finance and sustainability is no longer optional, it is essential. Whether you're an entrepreneur, policymaker, or global citizen, financial systems impact every aspect of our lives, and sustainability has become the cornerstone for long term economic growth and societal well being. Bridging these two areas is critical for addressing challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and systemic risks. Today's episode promises to be a masterclass in economics, sustainability, and global leadership. Our guest is Professor Sony Kapoor, a renowned macroeconomist, finance expert, and sustainability advisor with a career spanning banking, policymaking, strategy consulting, and international development. Professor Sony is the CEO of the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology, and Sustainability, professor of climate, geoeconomics, and finance at the European University Institute, and chief economist at Worthwhile Capital Partners, among many other influential roles. Recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum and a European young leader by Friends of Europe, Professor Sony has played pivotal roles in tracking the euro crisis, driving financial reforms, and advocating for sustainable economic development. He has advised governments, global organizations like the UN, IMF, and World Bank, and some of the world's largest financial institutions and corporations. With his incisive commentary and forward thinking approach, Sony Kapoor is a leading voice on the intersection of finance, technology, and sustainability in today's complex world. So, without further ado, let's dive into the fascinating conversation with Professor Sony Kapoor. Hi, Professor Sony. Welcome to the Aspire and Acquire show. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin the show by understanding your background a little bit. Of course, I've already introduced you, but your career spans across banking, policymaking, sustainability, and more. What experiences or insights sparked your interest in macroeconomics and sustainable development?
Well, so at one level, I had a very traditional Delhi middle class upbringing,
Mhm.
and ended up going to IIT Delhi and then MBA from FMS, and then the normal route to ICICI.
Right.
But when we were growing up, my parents had a fairly different perspective. So I remember from a very early age, it was drilled into us how ridiculously, insanely lucky we were in the context of India and in a broader historical context. And I remember my parents telling us that with this sort of fortune comes a responsibility. And I think there's a Spider-Man quote, isn't there, that with great power comes responsibility.
Yeah.
But for us, it was with fortune and luck. And again, my parents, there was never a single person who went empty-handed from our door. And in addition to their day job, so my father was a senior bureaucrat, my mother was a teacher. They always made time to be socially engaged. And after my
Mhm.
father retired, he did very active social work for many, many years. So we were brought up in a very socially aware household,
Mhm.
and in a very empathetic household. And so I always had that deep inside from a very young age. And that's where, a lifelong passion for impact comes from. And everything else has sort of happened partly by design, partly by accident. One of the first things was that while at IIT, most people were thinking about either very conventional measures of sort of professional success, CEO startups making a lot of money. I had a different perspective. I wanted to leave things better than I found them. And the other important thing was, again, there was a very and I think it's a broader Indian issue too, that there's a very strong quantitative focus in the engineering schools. And I think there's far too little focus on society and social issues and the softer disciplines that goes into that sort of engineering MBA education that most successful Indians sort of have passed through. And I was wired differently and was very attuned to those other things. And for example, at IIT, one of the subjects I picked up was drama and theater, and my one of my theses was on Pirandello, an
Mhm.
Italian playwright, and his famous play Six Characters in Search of an Author. I think he won the Nobel Prize for literature in the early 1900s. And yeah, so I started out sort of very conventionally. And after ICICI, I went to the LSE, and after that, Lehman Brothers, and I traded derivatives. I did private equity, leverage buyouts, but none of this it was more for the experience and learning the skills than as a profession. And my vocation was always different.
Mhm.
Um, and so I had an interesting experience sort of fairly early on, and that was when Enron started its slow collapse. They were my biggest counterparty when I was trading derivatives, and I saw firsthand the difference between Enron LLC Cayman Islands,
Mhm.
which was, essentially a shell entity set up for tax and regulatory arbitrage, and Enron PLC United Kingdom, a legitimate company with, real assets. And I became very aware, of course, having grown up in India in the 80s under the Bofors scandal and bribery, Switzerland, the tax haven, and the rest of it. I became aware of additional aspects of the international financial system that were problematic, and the role played in regulatory arbitrage, secrecy, etc., by tax havens. And so, with my investment banking bonus, I launched an international NGO called the Tax Justice Network, which I think is now present in like 40 or 50 countries. I don't remember exactly how many. And that has
Okay.
been very successful over the years. in getting a global agreement on minimum rates of taxation, exchange of information, reduction of bank secrecy, and a general weakening of the role of tax havens in the global financial system. And that was sort of my first taste of my life as a policy entrepreneur, where rather than focusing on setting up new for-profit financial firms,
Mhm.
I have focused on improving policy making across the world.
Interesting. From IIT to FMS and then trading derivatives and now sustainability, it's a very interesting journey that you've gone through. Tell us a little bit about the switch. What was the trigger from numbers to sustainability? That'll be interesting for the viewers or for the audience to really understand.
Well, so this was it was partly driven by a lived experience. So when I was in India, I was living on my own, and there's no video feed here, but there was a relatively small dustbin that used to fill up every day. And then when I moved to London, my lifestyle hadn't changed much, nor my consumption patterns. But the size of the dustbin that filled up every day grew fairly substantially. And then when I moved to the US, the dustbin became twice the
Even
size of the
bigger.
dustbin I had in London, right?
Oh,
Uh, and I think that sort of captured the environmental footprint consumption lifestyle in the contemporary societies, the difference between India and Europe and the United States. And that triggered something in me, having studied environmental engineering as part of my chemical engineering degree at IIT.
mhm,
And at school, I was involved in something called the school's environmental network. And we played some role in saying no to polythene bags in New Delhi and, stuff like so. So I was aware of the social and the environmental context, but that dustbin incident
mhm.
really sort of made me connect the micro with the macro when I realized and looked around me at suburban lifestyles in and around Kansas City, where I lived for a little while.
Right.
Um, Saw the big SUVs, and there was a fun incident there. So we didn't have derivative trading permission in Europe yet, and while we were waiting for that, I had to temporarily relocate my team to Kansas City.
Mhm.
And when I landed there, I was picked up at the airport and I was given the keys to an SUV, which was part of my package.
Right.
And I said, no, thank you. I have checked. But and I had a Danish girlfriend at the time who was also very sort of environmentally conscious. And I said, Vibeke, and I had checked, and there's a bus route that goes
Oh,
straight from my apartment to the
wow.
office. And I hear you laughing already. And everybody, there said, no, no, but this is part of the package. I said, yeah, yeah, I understand, but no, I don't need it. So I turned it down. And so that was the weekend I arrived. And on Monday, when I got in the bus, I realized how broken the system was, because the only other people in the bus were the drunks, the disabled, and it's not a
Right.
there's still a lot of lingering racism in Europe, in the US, and some blacks and Latinos,
Right.
and me. And when everybody else, of course, was driving, right? And that was very much in your face.
Mm.
And that and nobody, none of my colleagues sort of could get where I was coming from. And I think to sort of connect that experience to what I've been working on now, to give you an example of how stark things are on the environmental side. So if India reaches even half the resource intensity that China already has today,
Mhm.
uh, including carbon, including broader resource use, the numbers are so big that the world will overshoot 2.5 degrees of warming, right? And if India reaches the resource intensity that China has today, and that's not even including all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is about 1.2 billion people, then we've lost 3 degrees, right? So the micro lifestyles, environmental footprints of individuals around the world really, really do add up to broad planetary level consequences for the environment. And at 2.5, 3 degrees, most of North India will become unlivable. The monsoon patterns will change dramatically, and the heat in the Gangetic Plain would become intolerable. And for certain days in a year um, when the wet bulb temperature, at high humidity, high temperature exceeds 35, 36 degrees, the only way to survive is with air conditioning, and less than 5% of Indians have air conditioning, right?
Right.
So we are now um, at a stage in the global economy where the normally distinct worlds of this is global macroeconomic policy, this is global finance, this is development, and this is environment, which have normally been distinct silos worlds, those have collided. And in some ways, the single most important macroeconomic, financial, environmental, developmental, geopolitical question confronting the world is, what is a development model available to a country such as India,
Hmm.
which will deliver the 6 to 8% growth rates that India desperately needs,
Hmm.
but in a manner that is compatible with keeping global temperatures and global warming less than 2 degrees of warming. And what are the contours of this model? How can it be financed? What does it mean? And those are the so this has in some ways become the most important question confronting the global economy.
Sure. And all this need to be very, very sustainable, right? I mean, they can still achieve the growth, but if it's not being done in a fashion which is sustainable and scalable, then there's no point. I mean, it's something which is interesting, but at the same time, it's going to be damaging too. So one has to really think
Absolutely.
through. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why, so I've been trying now for a while to convince the World Bank to have this as its flagship program,
Hmm.
or the contours of this new development model. And I did some work with the Indian G20 on this,
Hmm.
and with the Brazilian G20. And there are, so there are some aspects that are relatively clear, right? So you and I are having this conversation over Zoom, and I'm sure that your professional life, as mine, has changed dramatically after COVID, where Zoom existed before, there was
Yeah,
Skype, but it was hardly ever used. There was, this was not considered a substitute for face-to-face interactions. And what Corona did was it normalized the remote delivery of high value added services. And that has created a amazingly fantastic opportunity for a country like India, which is traditionally strong in services, particularly at a time of record demographic asymmetry, where if you look at headlines in Europe, in Japan, and even in the US, all the headlines are dominated by demographic decline, labor market shortages, women are not having enough children. And at the same time, there are roughly 23 million Indians and sub-Saharan Africans coming into the workforce every single year. And as of today, only 4% of them will even be employed in the formal sector, leave alone having the opportunity to be the best version of themselves, as you and I do, right? And so there is amazing opportunity
mhm,
to combine this record demographic asymmetry with the liberalization of cross-border trade and services, which constitute 70% and rising of our economy, to create what can only be called the next golden age of globalization, which can simultaneously deliver 6 to 8% growth rates in the developing world, particularly in places such as India, while boosting growth by 1 or 2% in the rich, stagnating part of the world, such as Europe, with an environmental footprint that is much, much smaller than the traditional Chinese East Asian development model of large scale export of goods together with very intensive infrastructure investment domestically. And the carbon environmental footprint of an equivalent value added export of services from India versus goods from China can easily be 1/10. So it is possible to reconcile much faster global growth rates within a far more constrained environmental envelope if you do this through the remote delivery of increasingly high
Mhm.
value added services. And that is India's golden opportunity.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Switching gears, you have played a key role in addressing the euro crisis and driving financial reforms. Can you share the turning points in those efforts and what you learned about systemic resilience?
Yes. So I've had from my school days, I've had
Mhm.
an enduring interest in the European Union, and I can tell you why. So my father's family are from Okara in present-day Pakistan, and my mother's family were industrialists in Yanangyong in present-day Burma or Myanmar.
Mhm.
And both of them at the time of partition had to leave everything behind and came as refugees. And as you and I were growing up in India, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we if somebody joked that, hey, Pakistan's about to invade or Pakistan's about to, launch launch a missile our way, the threat was very serious and ever present, right? And you would actually seek shelter.
Mhm.
Now, that was 1947 in Europe. This has been the longest period, at least until the Ukraine invasion, of peace in Europe in centuries. And France and Germany, unlike India and Pakistan, killed millions of each other's citizens. And they have joint cabinet meetings. And if somebody joked to you
Mhm.
that, hey, Germany is about to invade France, you would rightly throw them out of the room, right? Because it's not a serious point.
Right. Right.
In the same amount of time as India and Pakistan continued to be at loggerheads, hardly trade with each other, continue to, have military build up against each other and spend, inordinate amount of resources for poor countries. The EU has managed to be history's single most successful peace and prosperity project where Germany and France have joint cabinet meetings, all important decisions are made jointly.
Mhm.
And imagine the prosperity we could unlock in the subcontinent if we were to even come half of the way
So true.
that Europe has managed to move on from the Second World War. So I've had this long abiding interest in the EU. And in fact, I lobbied very strongly in Norway for the EU to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which it eventually did. Um, but but what we saw in the euro crisis, and that's how why I got involved in the euro crisis, because I took it upon myself as someone who had to help contribute to saving the EU because it was far too important to fail. Because as with any other experiment in the pooling of sovereignty, it is a very hard thing to do, as we find out, even in the UN, where the pooling of sovereignty is much, much less. But that is where the world eventually needs to go if we are to tackle increasingly global problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's pandemics, whether it's the threats from unregulated artificial intelligence. All of these require countries to cooperate with each other, pool sovereignty, make compromises. And the EU is a sort of big template towards that. So our biggest, most successful project in the EU when I ran Redefine, this international think tank, was what we internally call lessons from developing economies for the rich world. But we never said that in public because there's far too much arrogance in the rich world in Europe to actually, take that seriously. But the idea was fairly simple, that Europe had had a great run,
Mhm.
but only during the crisis and after Lehman's failure was suddenly faced with situations like 20% unemployment in Spain, the need to restructure Greece's debt, the need to bail out many banks in Ireland, for example. And yet, South Africa has had unemployment of 25%. Argentina has gone through God knows how many debt restructurings. And the idea of limited policy space is actually an idea from development circles, because countries in Africa and Asia, as we saw with the East Asian crisis, have generally faced, much more constrained policy making space than the rich world did. And all of these countries had, in response to those challenges, come up with various policies, some successful, some not so successful. And the idea was, European policymakers had no experience with this because they'd had such a good run.
Mhm.
And we were able to bring very relevant experience from the developing world, from emerging economies, into the European policy debate, advising the IMF, advising the European Commission, the Parliament, in being able to confront the challenges that developing countries had dealt with for donkey's years. So we were involved in the restructuring of Greek debt. We were involved in the Irish bailouts. And I wrote one of the first blueprints for the ESM, the Crisis Management Fund, that rescued the Euro countries that were in trouble. And all of that was basically based on my work, global work with the World Bank, some of the work with the IMF, and in various parts of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And so it was partly coincidental that I happened to have the right experience, and partly by design that I wanted to be actively involved in helping the EU survive and navigate what was an existential challenge.
Right.
And what played a big role in the end in terms of the systemic resilience was, I think that the risk of failure was far, far too high. And when that was finally recognized in otherwise very contentious debates of who would pay for the bailouts, how should the burden of
Mm.
Greek debt restructuring fall, how much of it on Greek citizens, how much of it to be shared across other Eurozone citizens. When everybody sort of realized that the cost of the failure of the Eurozone would be an order of magnitude higher than any cost of making compromises, a compromise was sort of finally reached. And I think, similar lessons need to be learned now on issues such as climate change, where the cost of failure of keeping temperature, global warming under 2 degrees is at least an order of magnitude higher than anything any country would need to pay in order to tackle the crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Now, with your kind of background, it's important for us to talk about the interface between finance and sustainability because you managed both these worlds. What are the biggest obstacles preventing financial institutions and policymakers from fully embracing sustainability, and how can we overcome them?
Well, finance is inherently mostly backward looking. If you look at the assets under management of the largest investors in the world, including, for example, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I used to work with, they are invested in listed stocks around the world, And most of those reflect the industries and the big companies that exist today, right? And that are powerful today, that are have a lot of revenues today. And by its very nature, if we are as the world going to undergo what has to be the fastest, most systemic industrial and economic transformation undertaken by humanity ever, uh, a lot of the financing needs to go towards things that are new, that don't yet exist, that are just being tried out. And the financial system is structurally very bad at that sort of forward-looking commitment of resources. There have been historical instances of sort of bubbles and bursts where something has become very fashionable, for example, as artificial intelligence is now, and a lot of money gets thrown around towards that. But even if you look at, all of the money that is being invested in sustainable technology, in batteries, in EVs, in even in artificial intelligence, versus the money that is continuing to go towards the old, including unsustainable industries, further exploration of oil and gas, coal. It's still a relatively small proportion that is going into sort of forward-looking industries. So I think that is where finance alone, left to itself,
Mhm.
does not have the incentive structure and the capacity to deliver what is necessary on sustainability. And that is where the need for an overarching policy intervention that needs to change the incentives, whether it's through taxation, whether it's through de-risking, whether it is through providing guarantees or a combination of these towards investing in sustainable industries and sustainable technology and away from the assets that are likely to become stranded. For example, by making it mandatory to do climate stress testing
Yeah.
for all institutional investors.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just focusing on innovation, as we know, technology is a double-edged sword in finance and sustainability. How can innovations in fintech contribute to a greener and more equitable economy?
Well, so the going back to what we were discussing about the Indian economy, right?
Right.
So one of the most amazing things, and again, for a general sort of tech optimist such as me, has been when I travel to India with my kids and we are able to pay for ice cream,
Right.
with
Yeah.
Paytm, right? And before my parents died recently, almost all of their banking, tax, public authority transactions were done digitally, and they were in
Right.
their mid 80s. And that is just mind-bogglingly transformational. And it's so far ahead of where even, European economies are. In Germany, there's still, when you go to, there's sort of major restaurants and shops that say cash only, that will not accept credit cards. If you do ever deal with the German bureaucracy, in paperwork terms, it's probably now worse than Indian bureaucracy used to be. So I think so. One important contribution of this is uh, part of this new development model that I mentioned, and it's
Mhm.
called place-based development. It means that traditionally what has been the a core part of the development model, which is that folks move from the rural areas and agrarian sector to even live in slums, whether it's in Nairobi or whether it's in Rio de Janeiro or whether it's around Delhi, and then slowly, start engaging in more productive opportunities, whether it's in the manufacturing sector or the services sector, and then they send money back home through remittances, etc. But a different development model has become possible where if we combine focus of export of services, whether it's healthcare, education, accounting, taxation, across the board, right? Together with the remote delivery of public services, not just dealing with the tax department and banking and financial issues, but also, increasingly education, etc. Then it is possible for India to forego the construction of 50 second-tier soulless concrete jungle cities, as China has done. It is possible for India to forego a forced separation of families where, young children have no choice but to leave rural, semi-rural areas for a life in a polluted city. But it is possible to get, reasonably well-paid jobs, highly paid jobs from where you are. So, for example, at least in theory, there is no reason that the partner in charge of Goldman Sachs for Europe could not be living and working in a small village in Pondicherry, right?
Right.
With the occasional travel to Europe to meet clients, once every quarter or something. There is no reason that half of the employees of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund cannot be working remotely from wherever in India, whether it's in Delhi or whether it's in Uttar Pradesh or whether it's in a small hilly cafe in Uttarakhand.
Right.
And I think that is, and the digital stack development in India has created and massive opportunities to enable this sort of new development model, and the environmental footprint of this model again is far more benign than the Chinese way, where China in I think 2 or 3 years alone has used more concrete than the United States did in the entire last 100 years.
Wow.
And India neither has the resources nor the necessity to do that when we can have much more of place-based development that also caters to the need of the close family unit, and at the same time is able to integrate Indians into globally productive supply chains in services, because services are 70-80% of our economy and rising. And the potential for this to boost the global economy is at least twice as large as what we saw in the last golden age of globalization, where between the fall of the Berlin Wall and China's entry into the WTO, the number of workers engaged in globally productive supply chains in goods doubled. The potential
Mm.
to do it in services is at least twice as large.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, before we let you go, for our young aspirants, you have worn many hats: investment banker, policymaker, advisor, and strategist. What has been the most fulfilling chapter of your career so far, and why?
I
I know
think
it's a tough one. I know. If you're asking a parent, who's your favorite child, it's a question on those lines.
Well, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say all of them, but I will explain.
Yeah.
Uh, so we live now in a world of increasing super specialization where, more and more people focus on the one thing, and, people have two PhDs and they are splitting the hairs of hairs of hairs. And it's part and parcel of development, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we live in a world where there is so much knowledge, so many, so much diversity of disciplines, so much specialized knowledge that needs to be acquired, that there is a very strong requirement to spend, years and years mastering your craft, right? But we are also living in a world which has become, I think, far too siloed, where there is a need for interconnectors who are able to move across silos, whether it's silos of disciplines. For example, I work freely between the science of climate change to asset allocation for sovereign wealth funds to working on freeing up more capital for the World Bank to working on the design of public policy in Germany. Um, and I think that, this is an underexplored opportunity for young people who are very curious about the world, who enjoy learning for the sake of it, and who are able to, have the inner, I think, sense of security to be able to take a risk and jump disciplines. This same siloed problem exists also where, we have now pigeonholed, this is civil society, this is the business sector, this is the public sector, this is the startup community, this is, the established multinationals, etc. And again, these distinctions are far too outdated. And in order to bring about real innovation, real change, one needs to be able to interact with, communicate with, and sometimes move across these communities. And the same thing applies again across international borders, where, as I mentioned, what was very useful, being involved in debt restructuring in developing countries, suddenly became a very relevant skill to be applied in the European Union, something that could not have been foreseen. So having a natural curiosity that everybody has as a child and cultivating it and not letting it die, not suppressing it, continuing to take risks, calculated risks with your career and your life, being open-minded and embracing change. I think these are all essential parts of what can be a very fulfilling, successful, and impactful career, and one that is generally underestimated in a world where, there are these set tracks of sort of engineering MBA or medicine or IAS that young people get encouraged to pursue. And other career tracks are possible and necessary. And if you have the right curiosity and the right personality type, perhaps that is the right way for you.
Very inspiring. As we wrap up this enriching conversation with Professor Sony Kapoor, it's clear that the challenges of today's world, climate change, economic inequality, and financial instability, are deeply interconnected. Professor Sony's insights remind us that understanding the dynamics of finance and sustainability is not just the responsibility of policymakers and corporate leaders, but a shared imperative for all of us. Through his work and across global institutions and his relentless advocacy for systemic change, Dr. Sony amplifies the power of informed leadership and collaborative action. Let this conversation inspire you to think critically, act boldly, and engage meaningfully with the issues shaping our future. Thank you for tuning in to Aspire and Acquire. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and stay with us as we continue bringing you thought-provoking discussions with leaders who are changing the world. Until next time, take care and keep aspiring for greater impact. Today, we are recommending a beautiful documentary called Inside Job. It is an Oscar winning documentary that offers a gripping analysis of the 2008 global financial crisis. Through detailed storytelling, the film uncovers the systemic corruption and reckless practices in the financial industry that led to one of the worst economic collapses in the modern history. This powerful documentary serves as a wake up call about the need for financial reforms and transparency, making it essential viewing for everyone seeking to understand the intersection of finance policy and society. Happy watching.